Yesterday, we discussed at some length the so-called Antisemitism Awareness Act. And after that conversation, the bill passed the House with a bipartisan vote of 320 to 91. It won approval from both parties by wide margins. And now it heads over to the Senate, where prominent voices like Tim Scott have already voiced their support for it. Scott called it a momentous step towards rooting out anti-Semitic hate. And there was a lot of that sort of celebrating over at the House as well. Republican Representative Elise Stefanik said that the legislation is an incredibly important step to ensure that Jewish students and community members at America's universities feel safe. One of the Republican sponsors of the bill, Mike Lawler of New York, proclaimed that his bill is a key step in calling out anti-Semitism where it is. Here is Lawler in Congress explaining why this law is so necessary, allegedly. Watch.
I rise in support of my bill, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, and I want to thank my colleague, Congressman Josh Gottheimer from New Jersey, for his courage in leading on this issue. In every generation, the Jewish people have been scapegoated, harassed, evicted from their homeland, and murdered. Many of us remember the Holocaust as the most recent large-scale instance of this, but it was hardly the first in the Jewish people's long history of persecution. Prior to October 7th, it may have seemed like we were making progress in fighting anti-Semitism, especially in the United States. A prime example, Jewish students weren't afraid to attend classes on their college campuses. And yet today we hear calls for intifada ring out on school grounds. We see Jewish students being physically prevented from going to class, rioters chanting death to Israel and death to America, and so much more. In the U.S., Jews account for only 2.4% of the population, and globally they make up 0.2% of the world's population. The Jewish people need our support now.
Now, Mike Lawler's point here is that anti-Semitism is bad. All the other Republicans and Democrats who supported this bill offered similar justifications. Democrat co-sponsor Josh Gottheimer covered this same territory during his speech on the floor of the House. Listen.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of my bipartisan bill, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, to ensure that we're standing up to the Jew hatred that's spreading like wildfire on campuses across our country. I'm proud to lead this legislation with my friend and fellow Problem Solver Caucus member, Congressman Mike Lawler from New York. As we are voting today, in real time, our country's universities are experiencing a tidal wave of anti-Semitism. Protesters have targeted Jewish students, haranguing them with awful Jew-hating insults and cheering on Hamas, a barbaric foreign terrorist organization that murdered Americans on October 7th and still hold 5 living Americans hostage, including my constituent, Idan Alexander. I met with hostage families just this morning. I saw these protests up close, like many Americans did, at Columbia earlier this month. I've heard the sickening Jew-hating anti-Semitic comments comparing Zionists to Nazis, promising a redux of October 7th 1,000 times over, and calling for resistance, I quote, by any means necessary, and intifada revolution.
So once again, anti-Semitism is bad, he's saying, and indeed it is bad. But what we aren't hearing from the defenders of the bill, or even its sponsors, is why this particular bill is necessary or good or wise or ethical or constitutional. That's because it is none of those things. In fact, it is, without exaggeration, one of the worst pieces of legislation we have ever seen in our lifetimes. I already explained some of my objections to this proposed law yesterday, but let's go over this again now that I've had some more time to investigate it further, and then I have 2 additional thoughts to offer. But first, to review. The Anti-Semitism Awareness Act that just passed the House mandates that when the Department of Education enforces federal anti-discrimination laws, it does so according to a definition of anti-Semitism provided by something called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. So the legislation is mandating a certain definition of unlawful anti-Semitism, but it has farmed that definition out to this other group. Insanely, the bill itself never gives a definition. It only says that the definition is whatever the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance says it is. The bill adds that the examples of anti-Semitism provided by the same group shall henceforth also be a part of the legal definition of anti-Semitism. But of course, the bill doesn't tell you what those examples are either. Now, when we talked about this yesterday, I didn't know what the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance was. All that any of us really need to know is that it is not a legislative body of the United States government. Whatever it is, it certainly is not an organization that should have any ability to dictate legislation or define the terms in our laws. But the truth is even worse than it first appears. The IHRA is not just some random activist group. It is, as the I for international suggests, an international and intergovernmental organization founded by the Prime Minister of Sweden in 1998. It's comprised of international partners, quote unquote, like the UN and the EU, and then also 35 member countries, including the United States, the UK, and of course, Israel. Now, what this means is that our legislation is being farmed out specifically to foreign powers. Should this bill become law, it will mean that a group of foreign governments have had a say in developing speech restrictions that govern American citizens. Now, that is more than enough reason to oppose the bill absolutely and unequivocally. I would want to take this legislation and shoot it into the sun based solely on the fact that it gives foreign governments any power at all over our own people. Even if I otherwise agreed with the text of the bill, I would still oppose it on that basis alone. But I don't agree. No freedom-loving, self-respecting American should agree. As we talked about yesterday, if you go to the IHRA website to find out what their definition of anti-Semitism is, the first glance won't be very shocking. According to its definition, anti-Semitism is basically hatred of Jews. That makes sense. The trouble really starts, however, when you scroll down the page a bit and you get to examples of anti-Semitism that this cadre of foreign governments has provided. And there you'll find a number of examples which will have the force of law under this bill, including the following. Quote, these are all examples of anti-Semitism. Accusing the Jews as a people or Israel as a state of inventing or exaggerating the Holocaust. Accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel or to the alleged priorities of Jews worldwide than to the interests of their own nations. Denying the Jewish people the right to self-determination, e.g. by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. Applying double standards by requiring of it behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. Using the symbols and images associated with classic anti-Semitism, e.g. claims of Jews killing Jesus or blood libel, to characterize Israel or Israelis. Drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. Holding Jews collectively responsible for actions of the State of Israel. Now, there are a number of very serious problems here. The first is that most of these examples of anti-Semitism, statements that the bill would legally classify as hate speech against Jews, are actually criticisms of the Israeli government. And whether you think the criticisms are fair or not, whether you think they're true or not, it should go without saying that American citizens have the right in any and all contexts to criticize foreign governments in whatever way and using whatever language they want. You should be able to say anything you want about a foreign government, including it's evil, it's terrible, it shouldn't exist, it should be wiped off the face of the earth. Now, I'm not saying it's right to say that, but of course you should have the right, have the right to say that about a foreign government as an American citizen. Are you kidding me? We have the right to criticize foreign government. We have the right to criticize our own government. So we must certainly then have the right to criticize the governments of other nations. Now, keep in mind, it's not just one or two opinions about the Israeli government that you're not allowed to have under this bill. That would be bad enough. Dictating the viewpoints that Americans can have or express about a foreign country is pure madness. It is evil, no matter how limited the rules might be. But these rules are actually incredibly wide in their scope. After all, it says that applying double standards to the state of Israel is anti-Semitic. Well, there are hundreds of opinions you might have about Israel that could be classified as double standards. And who determines which opinions are double standards and therefore forbidden? Well, apparently the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance gets to decide. You may recall that Israel is a member country in this alliance, which means that Israel has a hand in deciding which opinions about itself are lawful for Americans to express. When I said that this is one of the worst pieces of legislation we've ever seen, I wasn't exaggerating. Now, there's another example on the list that's gotten some attention. It's anti-Semitic to claim that Jews killed Jesus. That's what the IHRA says. But that is not a claim invented by anti-Semites. That's in the gospel. According to every gospel account of Christ's passion, the Romans carried out the execution of Jesus at the insistence and behest of the Jewish authorities that handed him over to be killed and the mob that called for his death. Now, that's what the gospel says. It may be true that some actual anti-Semites, as in those who hate Jews, have used these biblical passages as a justification for their hatred. But that does not make the passages themselves false or evil or anti-Semitic. And it certainly doesn't give Congress the right to tell Christians that they cannot believe or repeat what is in those passages. It is an incredibly dangerous precedent to put anything into law, anywhere, for any reason, declaring aspects of the Bible hate speech. So this bill is dangerous and unconstitutional and wrong on every level. But even that doesn't fully capture the insanity, because on top of all these problems, it also won't do the thing that it's supposedly meant to do, which is combat anti-Semitism. In fact, it will only make anti-Semitism worse. And this is a point so obvious that I didn't even bring it up in the past, because it's obvious to everyone except for the morons who came up with this bill. Everyone else can see, right, that telling Americans that they can't believe or say certain things about certain groups of people will not actually stop anyone from believing or saying those things. Certainly won't stop them from believing it. The most you could hope is to stop them from saying it, but you won't stop them from believing it. Instead, if it achieves anything, it will only cause people to be resentful towards and suspicious of the group you're allegedly trying to protect. Now, as for putting an end to the lawlessness and chaos on college campuses right now, this bill will not accomplish that either, because we didn't need any new law to address that problem. Simply enforcing existing laws against vandalism, burglary, trespassing, violence, incitement, and so on, will be more than enough. As always, the cause of the chaos is not that we lack certain laws that we need, but that the laws that we already have and need are not being enforced. Enforce the law. Don't write new ones to solve a problem caused by the lack of enforcement of the existing ones. And that's all that needs to be done. And from a political perspective, that's all that Republicans in particular need to say. The campus protests are a problem primarily for Democrats. These are leftist radicals protesting the leftist administrators at their schools and the leftist political leaders who are not doing everything that the radicals want. Okay, it is a problem on the left and for the left. All the Republicans need to do in order to win politically is call for the enforcement of existing laws and then move on and stay out of it. It is the easiest win in the world. And so, of course, Republicans who have never met a situation they can't screw up have found a way, as always, to rescue defeat from the jaws of victory. Rather than sit back and let the Democrats deal with the Frankenstein they created, Republicans have pushed themselves to the front so that the eggs being chucked at the Democrats can land squarely on their own faces instead. Like, rather than calling for the enforcement of existing laws and then getting out of the way, they're coming up with new hate speech laws. Laws that grant profound new powers to the government, which will be used against conservatives and Christians as soon as they are passed. That's what we get from our elected Republicans, who are nothing if not useless frauds and morons all the time. And that is why the useless, fraudulent Republicans responsible for this are the ones who are today canceled. If you'd like to see what else I have to say, you can access my full show by going to dailywire.com or by going to the Matt Walsh Show Twitter page. Hope to see you there. Godspeed.